Hey guys, today I'll be discussing how European exploitation of the indigenous peoples back in the 15th century influences the strict border laws that we see today in America. Please remember to like and subscribe if you enjoy what you see for more amazing content. Without further ado, let's get into it. As we progress through time, it's obvious that history shapes the present in several ways. For example, legalized racial segregation in the past continues to fuel racial inequality today. Social movements allowed communities to enjoy more rights. War shapes national identities and geopolitical landscapes, and there's many more cases. In the 15th century, European powers embarked on a brutal campaign of colonization, pushing the indigenous population off their land, enslaving many, and completely reshaping their cultures. But what if I told you that the legacy of that exploitation is still impacting the world today, especially when it comes to modern issues like immigration and border laws? From the very first encounters between Europeans and the indigenous nations of the Americas, power dynamics, violence, and control over the land were at the heart of it all. But it wasn't just about physical borders. It was about creating systems that justified the removal and subjugation of entire populations. In today's world, we see a similar story playing out, but with a new set of borders, those that divide countries, nations, and people, specifically strict immigration laws here in the United States. So how do old patterns of exploitation and land appropriation still affect how we view borders today? And what can history teach us about our approach to immigration, race, and identity in modern America? In this video, we'll explore the connections between European colonialism and the dehumanization of indigenous peoples through the use of Stuart Hall's essay, The West and the Rest, Discourse and Power. In this essay, Hall examines how Western colonial powers constructed their identities in opposition to the non-Western world. He argues that these identities were shaped through discourse and ideology, which served to justify and perpetuate colonial domination. Stay with me as we unpack the uncomfortable truths about history, borders, and the fight for justice that continues today. Let's dive in. Stuart Hall was a Jamaican-born British Marxist sociologist, cultural theorist, and political activist. He is considered to be one of the founding figures of cultural studies. His work explored the ways in which culture, identity, and power intersect, particularly through the lens of race, class, and post-colonialism. Ideas that stem from Hall serve as a foundation in fields like media studies, post-colonial theory, and critical race studies. When taking a look at his essay, The West and the Rest, Discourse and Power, Stuart Hall critically examines how Western powers have historically constructed their identity in the opposition to the rest, the non-Western world. He argues that the West, through colonialism and imperialism, has used discourse to define itself as superior, rational, and civilized, while portraying colonized people as inferior, primitive, and in need of Western intervention or civilizing. Hall explores how these racialized and cultural binaries were not only central to justifying colonial dominance, but to continue to shape the global power relations in the post-colonial era. By analyzing the ways in which knowledge and power are produced through language and representation, Hall reveals how the West's cultural and political dominance has been maintained and reproduced through discourse. The essay underscores the lasting legacy of colonialism in shaping contemporary ideologies, global inequalities, and racial hierarchies. It is in this essay that we can see four key concepts that he goes over. The first one being discursive formation. Discursive formation could be the ways of talking, thinking, or representing a subject or certain topic. These statements could be grouped into a systematic collection of ideas, terms, and frameworks used by many people. In his own words, Hall states that a discourse can be produced by many individuals in different institutional settings. A discourse draws on the elements of other discourses, binding them into its own network of meanings, and that the statements within a discursive formation need not to be all the same, but the relationships and differences between them must be regular and systematic, not random. Another concept he delves into is the idea of a resume of truth. It is the aim to create a way of thinking that defines what is true and limits the options of thought about a certain topic. A good example that Hall provides the readers was when many myths and legends told of a race of giant people, and in the 1520s, Magellan's crew brought back stories of having encountered, in South America, such a race of giants whom they dubbed Patagons, literally meaning big feet. The area of the supposed encounter became known as Patagonia, and the notion became fixed in the popular imagination, even though two Englishmen who visited Patagonia in 1741 described its people as being average-sized. A third element that is talked about in the essay is knowledge linked to power and how it assumes the authority of truth and having the power to make something true. By inserting the quote from the French historian Michael Foucault, we should admit that power produces knowledge, that power and knowledge directly imply one another, that there is no power relation without the correlative constitution of a field of knowledge, nor any knowledge that does not presuppose and constitute power relations. Hall backs up his claim that it is power rather than facts about reality which makes things true. Finally, the last concept explored is the act of discursive strategies, which is the way in which a community aims to shape public perception on a subject. Some specific strategies identified by Hall are idealization, projection, imposition of categories, and the failure to recognize and respect differences, which lead to the oversimplification of things and split subjects into good or bad. Now that you're all familiar with Stuart Hall's The West and the Rest, Discourse and Power, let's get into the issue at hand. The history of Mexican immigration to the United States is shaped by a complex interaction of economic, political, and social factors. Beginning in the late 19th century, U.S. employers turned to Mexico to recruit cheap and unskilled labor. For much of the 20th century, Mexicans migrated to the U.S. primarily to seek better wages and living conditions. Many were pushed north by poverty and unemployment in Mexico, and pulled by the promise of higher-paying jobs in the industries like agriculture, construction, and manufacturing. Mexican migration was also influenced by moments of political turmoil, such as the Mexican Revolution and the Cristero Revolt, when many Mexicans fled to the U.S. to escape political or religious persecution. Over time, women became a significant part of the migration flow, making up 40% of the total immigration population by the 1980s. These women were primarily employed in service industries as domestics and nannies. The most significant shift in migration patterns occurred in the post-World War II era. The Bracero program in 1942 allowed for the temporary importation of Mexican laborers to meet U.S. labor demands. However, as the U.S. economy grew and immigration laws tightened, many Mexicans began migrating illegally, leading to increasing hate towards Mexicans. By the 1990s, these immigrants were referred to as illegal aliens. Hatred reached a peak after the September 11, 2001 attacks, when there were concerns about national security that led to harsher immigration enforcement. Today, Mexican immigration is a huge issue in American politics. Following the 2024 election of Donald Trump, many immigrants are in fear of what's to come and how the new administration could impact their families. According to CNN, Trump promised to deport millions of people, as well as send some to detention facilities. This is without a doubt scary to listen to, especially if you are a migrant with hopes of creating a better life for yourself and those you love. It's clear that Trump sees immigration as the biggest threat to our country, despite CBP.gov stating that the number of people who cross the border without encountering CBP has decreased approximately 60% from 2023 to 2024. However, there are tons of Americans who support Trump's policies, and you might be wondering how the Republican Party is able to gather such a following. When applying Stuart Hall's concepts that he discusses in his essay, The West and the Rest, Discourse and Power, we can observe how the way Republicans justify their strict border law policies are similar to how Europeans in the 15th century justified the subjugation and colonization of non-European peoples. Using the concept of discursive formation as a basis for my argument, it is clear that Donald Trump and the Republican Party have effectively used discursive formation to justify strict border policies by creating a narrative that connects immigration to themes of national security, economic prosperity, and cultural identity. Again, discursive formation refers to the way language and discourse shape and construct social realities, often by framing certain issues in a particular way that influences public perception and policy. The use of phrases like illegal immigrants, criminal gangs, drug cartels, and animals frames immigration as a criminal or violent phenomenon rather than a social issue or a human rights concern. For example, in one of his speeches, he says this:
But Kamala has imported an army of illegal alien gang members and migrant criminals from the dungeons of the third world.
As we saw in the 15th century, if one keeps spreading word about a particular group or an idea in a certain way, it could influence public perception and shape policy decisions over time. When looking through the lens of Hall's teachings, we can see that Trump and the Republican Party create a discourse where immigration is not viewed as a complex issue involving human rights, but rather as an immediate threat to American society. Furthermore, despite framing Latin immigrants as dangerous criminals or threats to national security, Trump and his allies consistently ignore the fact that the majority of immigrants crossing the border are families escaping from violence, poverty, and instability. Many of these individuals are seeking a better life and not to engage in criminal activity. By portraying immigrants as criminals, Trump aimed to make a narrative that justified the harsh policies he favors, including the building of the wall, the separation of families, and the detention of individuals seeking refuge. This representation of immigrants is a key example of how power shapes knowledge. By repeatedly associating immigration with crime and danger, the Trump administration works to normalize the idea that the presence of immigrants is a national crisis. Both public opinion and what is considered true about immigration is redefined when these false accusations and the demonization of immigrants is being spread around, making their claims of a border crisis seem legitimate. Through the strategic use of power to manipulate the truth about immigration, Trump is able to insert uncompromising border laws and policies that were justified by the knowledge he helped create. All in all, Trump's discursive strategies rely on creating an us versus them narrative by framing the issues of immigration as a national threat. Repeatedly using terms such as illegal aliens, criminals, and animals make people think that there is a risk to American safety. It serves to simplify immigration issues as a threat to the U.S. population. Additionally, Trump's emphasis on the need for a physical barrier plays into fears of vulnerability, which raises a sense of emergency. This leads to the repeated portrayal of the border as something broken and under attack, which contributes to a regimen of truth where strict immigration enforcement becomes urgent. These discursive choices of framing immigration as a crisis, using demeaning language, and seeing the border wall and mass deportation as a solution, legitimizes the policies he advocates for. It's easy to see that by constructing a reality in which the country's security is threatened by immigrants, Trump effectively holds his position and approaches immigration with a more militarized and exclusionary campaign. In conclusion, it's clear that we see the same strategies that the Europeans from the 15th century used to justify their exploitative attacks on the natives of the Americas. Just like how the Europeans described non-European peoples as savages that threatened their civilizations, Trump and his supporters made the narratives that depict Latin immigrants as dangerous criminals and also a threat to the U.S. population. This type of discourse shapes the public's perception by defining what could be seen as true and thus justifying harsher policies for border control, which couldn't have been done without the use of demeaning terms to refer to the immigrants, the creation of the us versus them kind of divide, and the portrayal of immigrants as criminals. As a result of the strategies being used, Trump effectively built a regimen of truth that normalizes the idea of border enforcement as a needed thing. Now, after all I've explained, it's pretty straightforward that the power of discourse, as Hall suggests in his essay, The West and the Rest, Discourse and Power, constructs and maintains divisions between communities where one comes out as having more power than the other. It makes policies that would otherwise be considered inhumane seem not only acceptable, but also necessary. If we allow the reinforcement of exclusionary practices, there will be a never-ending cycle of fear and mistrust. Thanks for watching my video and staying to the end. This was a topic that I really wanted to speak out on. And like I mentioned before, if you liked the video, please subscribe and like. Happy holidays and have a great one, everybody.